Hi everyone, good afternoon, officially, yes, good afternoon. Welcome to the Institute for Gender Development Studies and our Lunchtime seminar series. And we are really happy and pleased to have Dr. Rosamond King here with us today. And the title of her presentation today, 150 Years of Jamettes, Thinking Sexuality, Race and Gender in Trinidadian Protest Performance. And let me tell you a little bit about Rosamond. She is a critical and creative writer and artist whose scholarly work focuses on Caribbean and African literature, sexuality, and performance. King's recent book, Island Bodies, Transgressive Sexualities in the Caribbean Imagination, right there, received the 2015 Caribbean Studies Association Gordon K. and Sybil Lewis Prize for the Best Caribbean Studies Book. Island Bodies is a comparative pan-Caribbean study that examines how those in the Caribbean and its diaspora work within and resist the region's binary gender systems and heteropatriarchy. And she has one hardcover copy with her for only $200 TT. So think about it. Her academic work has been widely published in journals and anthologies, including Callaloo, Women in Performance, the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, Sable, and the Journal of African American Studies. In addition, King has received numerous awards such as a Fulbright Award and fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson, Mellon, and Ford Foundations, Poets House, and the Franklin Furnace Fund. Her poetry has appeared in more than a dozen journals and anthologies, such as the award-winning Kindergarten Experimental Poetry for Children, The Caribbean Writer, The America's Review, and Downtown Brooklyn, as well as the chapbook At My Belly and My Back. King has performed around the world, including most recently at the Encuentro Festival in Montreal, the Afri-Performa African Performance Art Biennale, Dixon Place, and the Badass Women's Festival. To learn more about her performance art, come to Dangerous Curves, a conversation about performance and politics with Rosamond King, Gabrielle Seville, and Attila Springer next Tuesday at 7 p.m. at Alice Yard. King is an assistant professor at Brooklyn College, part of the City University of New York, where she teaches Caribbean and African literature, creative writing, and performance, where she is also the director of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program. King is also chair of the Caribbean region of the International Resource Network, which aims to provide an online clearinghouse for thoughtful work by and about Caribbean sexual minorities. Through the IRN, she's co-edited the multimedia collection, Theorizing Homophobias in the Caribbean, and the forthcoming collection with the journal Sargasso entitled Love, Hope, Community, Sexualities and Social Justice in the Caribbean. Other community and professional service includes sitting on the board of the Organization of Women Writers of Africa and the Audre Lorde Project, as well as the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies in New York. It's my pleasure to introduce Rosamond. Thank you for being here. Let's give her a welcome.
Thank you so much. I love how you read the part about the IRN as though you weren't my co-chair. She's my co-chair. We're equal partners in that very heavy endeavor. So thank you to the IGDS for hosting me, all of the faculty and staff who have helped put this together. Patricia, Deborah, Catherine, Angelique, Gabby, everybody. IGDS is kind of my home away from home, so I'm always happy to be here. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Tao family and the travel fellowship that they fund, which provided the funds for me to be here, and Alice Yard, where I'm staying while I'm here. I have a cold, so you have to excuse me, and if I know you, I'm not going to kiss you because I don't want to pass on this cold. So, many of you are familiar with the Jamettes, yeah? And I know that some of you have actually already read my earlier research on this topic, published in the book Sex and the Citizen by Faith Smith and in the journal Woman and Performance. So I'm engaged currently in the research to find out more about these women, but I want to make sure we all have some of the same information. So today I'll give you a brief overview of who the Jamettes were and 3 of the major protests that they were involved in. I will then present 3 contemporary examples that might be related in spirit to the Jamettes. 1 example from the 20th century and 2 from the last few weeks. This project is in its early phases, so I look forward to your comments and questions during our discussion time. And if you know of any resources that might be useful to me, I look forward to hearing about those as well. And Dr. Brereton has been very generous in already giving me a peek into her brain to provide some extra resources. As most of you know, the term Jamette is unique to Trinidad and originally refers to those considered below the diameter, the diamètre, of respectable society in the late 1800s. The Jamettes were poor, urban Afro-Trinidadians who worked in low-wage and or informal sectors in positions such as domestic workers, laborers, prostitutes, gamblers. Jamette women became especially infamous for behavior that scandalized the colonial upper classes, including their social protests and the way they celebrated carnival. An 1869 newspaper wrote that, quote, without political power, unorganized and mostly illiterate, they used the only tools available to them, shouting and screaming, end quote. And an 1874 article talking about that year's carnival wrote, quote, as for the number of girls masked in men's clothing, we cannot say how many hundred are flaunting their want of shame, end quote. So I believe that there is a connection between Jamette women's carnival performances and their street protests. We often talk about them in relationship to carnival, but these were some of the same people that were involved in the social protests. So I'm here now conducting research at the National Archives, predominantly at the National Archives and at the UWI West Indiana Collection, to find out more information about these women's lives. This is extremely difficult precisely because a lot of the women were illiterate. So the majority of the texts that I'm looking at are newspapers, which were written mostly by white men of the planter class. So you can imagine how challenging that is to have as your main sources people who revile the people who you're trying to write about. So that is my challenge. My final project, which right now I'm calling TransTemporal Jamette, will consist of a series of public performances and a critical biomythography that will document this group of women notorious for their scandalous political behavior and carnival performances. The implicit promises of emancipation in 1834, primarily control of one's body and its labor and relationships, as well as education and upward economic mobility, were left largely broken or unfulfilled. Freedom consisted of inadequate and limited employment and education, and was further restricted by the many laws and ordinances passed to control black bodies and behavior. The unspoken purpose of all of those laws, these were laws against vagrancy, and how do you prove you're not a vagrant, right? There were laws against idleness, laws about your relationship to your employer if you were domestic. And the implicit point of these laws was to try to encourage people to stay working on the plantations. Today I'm going to focus on 3 protests that were demanding specific freedoms. In all 3 of these protests, Jamette women were an important constituency, if not at the forefront. One is the Kembla Uprising of 1881, which called for the freedom to celebrate carnival the way the people wanted to, including the implicit references to slavery in Kembla. The second is a protest against the Contagious Diseases Ordinance of 1869, which called for freedom from over-policing and invasive punishment. And the third were the so-called water riots of 1903, which called for the maintenance of free access to water. All of these protests were loud and confrontational, involving singing, dancing, drumming, shouting, and the throwing of stones. Of course, public protests are not the only way to address social problems. There are also formal ways to protest, such as through legislation, policy, and research, or through formal organizations within or outside of the government. But I am focusing on public protests because for poor, disenfranchised people who did not have access to the vote, using their bodies and their voices was an effective method to get their grievances heard. People are familiar with the 1881 Kembla Uprising? So some people in the room? Okay. So the 1881 Kembla Uprising was a large group of Afro-Trinidadians in Port of Spain who were protesting the probable rumor that the colonial government was basically going to stop Kembla, right, by preventing public procession, by preventing the use of flambeaux, the use of drums, the use of sticks. And the police under Captain Baker had been moving towards that and doing that specifically in 1880, the year before. So it was a rumor, but it was a probable rumor. We know that both men and women were involved in the canboulay and carnival at this time, and we know that many people felt that women were at the forefront of a lot of the carnival celebrations. So even though the women are not singled out for this particular instance in the archive, in terms of what I've been able to find so far, I think we have to assume that they were there at the front with the men. People are familiar with the water riots? 1903, that's taught in the schools, I presume? No?
Yeah.
Scandalous.
The water riot.
Is it taught at school?
If it was taught
Is it taught in the school?
I thought you said
We need some,
Well, some of us aware, but not at the school.
we need some curriculum revision, I think. Because the water riots were considered, in 1903, were considered by a lot of people to be one of the first major movements towards self-rule and eventually independence. So again, a large segment of the society, the people who actually participated in the protest, included a lot of poor and working class people, but the people who supported the protest included a lot of middle class people as well. They weren't necessarily in the streets throwing stones. And they were protesting again proposed legislation that would have imposed fees for the uses of municipal water. So the use of water was free at the time, and they were saying people should pay for water. And the reality was that poor people were probably going to end up paying more than rich people for water, even though at the time, a lot of wealthy people in Port of Spain had these tubs that would hold 1,000 gallons of water or 2,000 gallons of water. And they would fill them by leaving the taps on all night. And then they'd use them the next day and then just leave the taps running constantly. So they were using a lot of the water. And that was what people were protesting, having to pay for water. So historian John Cowley wrote that women from the Jamettes played a prominent assault on the Red House in 1903, dancing and singing in the streets as they approached the building before they began throwing stones. And again, their role is not always singled out or remembered. Even at the time, the way that women were talked about was kind of as the Jamette sluts in calypsos, not so much as kind of warrior women who were helping to fight. So now I'm going to be surprised if anybody's heard of the Contagious Diseases Ordinance.
Victorian thing to check women's bits.
Yes, to check women's bits. Yes. So the Contagious Diseases Ordinance of 1869 was created. The protest that I'm going to talk about took place in 1881, the same year as the Kembla Uprising, which is interesting. But the ordinance was modeled on legislation instituted in England as a means of combating the spread of venereal diseases. So it's called Contagious Diseases, but it's specifically about venereal diseases. Essentially, the same legislation was enacted in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and in other parts of the British Empire. So this ordinance required that women who were accused of being common prostitutes, was the term, be registered as such, be periodically examined in a hospital for venereal disease, and if disease, be incarcerated in the hospital in a certified hospital ward. So at the this is very interesting because at the time people are not actually being arrested for prostitution per se and put in jail. That is not something that you see in the record. It's considered illegal, but it's not kind of codified as such, right? But what they're saying is we're going to incarcerate you in the hospital. So the threat of being registered as a common prostitute was used by some police officers as leverage to rape women who would have a hard time proving the rape or proving that they were not prostitutes. And of course you can imagine who those vulnerable women are. When a policeman approaches you on the street, how do you prove you're not a prostitute? Right? Unless you have a white employer to vouch for you, there's essentially no way for you to prove that you are not a common prostitute. So in 1881, the protest took place while a certain Sergeant Holder was on trial for the 20th time for using his power to extort sex from a woman. Holder, hold her like a claw. It would tear out your humanity if it thought you had any. Holds a badge, like a claw, to make your dignity bleed, to make you gag. This claw digs its blunt into you. Swallow it, or else. The badge tells you to get naked and like it. Light pricks your belly, then pitch grinds your knees. The stick tells you to like it. So you like it better than prison, better than more holders, more badges, more guns. Laughter like a claw that never leaves you, never removes its pointy end from your throat now stretched wide. A claw to suck the flesh off of. And your whole body is your throat stretched wide, and you are still screaming. Why are you still screaming? A receptacle does not scream. A waste bin does not scream. A throat filled with a claw should not be able to. A throat that is a whole body resonates at another frequency. Sometimes in your everyday you feel the earth thrumming with the scream of a throat that is a body that a claw tried to fill and failed. Tried to fill and failed. The throat that is a body pierced by the thing like a claw screams and the bleeds and the blood dries, though the scream goes on forever. It does not become a song, though there is a song. The pierced hole is a second throat, a double sound screaming, thrumming, ground song, ringing, ears hear, hear, hear. The women's protest in November 1881 was described by a contemporary scholar as the women, quote, shouting and screaming their way to their weekly examination, end quote. So you can imagine, after 19 women unsuccessfully accused the same policeman of rape, with the presumed injury when the cases were dismissed that the women then had to register as prostitutes, why these women would resort to protesting in the street. So, how did these early protests fare? The Kembla Uprising had an immediate positive effect. To stop the disturbances, which had more or less taken over the town, the governor himself came out of his house to say that everything had been a big misunderstanding. The Campbell was not going to be cancelled, and that if the revelers would remain peaceful, that the police would leave them alone. And both parties more or less stayed true to their word, and the remainder of the 1881 carnival, as well as the 1882 carnival, were relatively peaceful. I believe that the success of the Kembla Uprising, as well as the mounting abuses of power that the Contagious Diseases Ordinance allowed, led to the protest against the latter only 7 months later. The protest against the Contagious Diseases Ordinance failed to bring out any change in the official legislation, which remained in operation until 1887. But Sergeant Holder was finally convicted in December of 1881, and he was dismissed from the police force and returned to Barbados, where he was from. It seems plausible, if not likely, that the woman's outcry had some effect on this verdict. Perhaps the protest would have had an even greater effect if men had joined in, as they did in the other two protests discussed here. The so-called water riots, like the Kembla Uprising, had a positive outcome. The proposed legislation was not passed, and several colonial administrators, including the governor of the time, were reassigned out of Trinidad and Tobago as punishment for their handling of the situation. England was basically like, what happened down there? And the head of the fire department, the police, they all were either reassigned or were extremely chastised for their behavior. In addition, however, dozens of protesters were prosecuted, as well as several prominent colored and black Trinidadian men for inciting the protest through speech or through letters to the editor or through publishing letters to the editor and so on. And then there were at least 15 protesters killed and at least 45 wounded, and of course the Red House was set on fire, right? So it was a very big deal. As part of my project, I'm also looking at 20th and 21st century women who might be considered as continuing the connection between performative social protest and the female body. So the 20th century person I'm looking at so far as a contemporary within the Jamette tradition is Jean Miles. People are familiar with Jean Miles? Okay. So, of course, she was a secretary in the 1960s when she decided to expose political and official corruption. In a classic maneuver, lawyers tried to use her sexuality to discredit her while she was giving testimony to an official commission of inquiry, asking her things like, did you ever pose topless, and things like that, right? While Miles, a Trinidadian of Portuguese descent, is now seen by some as a hero, at the time she was vilified in the press, particularly because of, as you can see, the fashionable, flamboyant way she liked to dress, and many rumors were spread about her sexuality. She lost her job, and it took years for her then boss to lose his job over the scandal. By then it was too late for her. She was unable to find another position. Most sources, if you look up information about her, say only that after the scandal, Miles became a drunk and she was wandering the streets of Port of Spain. Only a few point out that she was gang raped, an event that traumatized her and surely contributed to her alcoholism. All of this negative attention resulted in a nervous breakdown and in her premature death. Even if the rape was not engineered as retribution for her protest against political corruption, the campaign against her successfully branded her as a woman who was fair game for attack, both metaphorical attack in the halls of government and physical attack on the street. So as I'm sure you all know, in the last few weeks there has been a separate situation that has linked carnival performances, sexuality, and social protest. And I'm speaking, of course, of the unfortunate murder of Asami Nagakia, Tim Key's comments about that murder, and the ensuing controversy. I am not claiming Nagakia as a Jamette for a variety of reasons, but the situation around Tim Key's comments led to local Trinidadian activists connecting sexuality and politics. So today I don't want to focus on what Tim Key said, I want to focus on the activists' reactions to his comments. And some of those activists are in the room, so they'll correct me if I say anything that's wrong. Less than 24 hours after the then mayor stated that women have a responsibility to prevent their own rape and murder by not playing mass or not playing particular kinds of mass and behaving in lewd and vulgar manners, a group of women activists organized a protest in Woodford Square that attracted over 100 people. Many of the women came in bikinis or other attire that might be considered lewd or vulgar. This protest, which was widely covered by local and international media, as well as an online petition and international outrage, led to the mayor's resignation less than a week later. Just a few weeks after this incident, another controversy erupted about the public display of women's bodies in the Trinidadian public sphere. Trinidadian gymnast Thema Williams' Olympic dreams were put on hold when the board of the Trinidad and Tobago Gymnastics Federation decided to review her appropriateness to represent the country after a topless but covered image of her was made public. Images that she removed from her own Instagram page less than 24 hours after posting them in 2015. In an interesting twist, a similar topless but covered image of Marissa Dick, the woman second in line to represent TNT, also surfaced online. Nikki Crosby, a popular Trini actress and comedian, and also she's Williams' godmother, quickly arranged the We Support Thema campaign, a series of graphic photographs of female Trinidadian celebrities and athletes posing in a similar manner to Williams' photograph. You've probably seen these on Facebook and in the newspaper and so on, because they have individual ones as well as the group ones. So again, it's useful to examine the efficacy of these public protests. In relationship to Jean Miles' whistleblowing, as I mentioned earlier, many years after the inquiry, Kenneth Tam lost his job. An unintended consequence of Miles' bravery was an attempt in 1990 to erect a statue in her honor. This proposal and the related expenditure of funds during a recession incensed some people so much that it was reportedly one of the incidents that led to the attempted coup. When he heard about the proposed statue, supposedly Abu Bakr spat out the statement, "Build a statue to who? A social prostitute?" Just as the word Jamette, used to designate a subpopulation but has now become a slur for loose woman, Jean Miles used to be only a name, but now it is also a threat. People are afraid to become a Jean Miles, or people are told, "I go make a Jean Miles out of you." So, given all of these different factors, we can debate how successful her protest was. On the other hand, the protest against Tim Key's remarks can easily be considered successful. The mayor eventually resigned, and some of the protesters have already met with the new mayor to ask for specific actions related to gender violence. Excuse me. In fact, at a town hall meeting addressing gender-based violence hosted by the new mayor, Kieran Valentine, at City Hall last week, the mayor announced that he and his council have decided to create what I think is the first gender policy for the city of Port of Spain, yeah? So the effects of that initial protest and the relating ongoing work may actually be historic and will continue to be evident potentially for years to come. Regarding the We Support Thema campaign, this seems to change by the minute. But based on the last thing that I read, the local Gymnastics Federation met, and it seems that they will actually allow her to go to the preliminary event, yeah? So they've decided that not only are they going to let her continue to represent Trinidad and Tobago, but they're not going to penalize her chances, which they had initially said that it was almost like Tim Key, I'm going to resign. No, I'm not. Yes, I am. Kind of back and forth. And again, we don't know for a fact, but it would seem that the attention brought to the issue by this online and media campaign probably contributed to that decision. There are several differences between the 19th and early 20th century protests and those that happened more recently. In the 19th century, Black, Indian, and colored Trinidadians could not vote and were largely outside of the government. In contrast, not only could Jean Miles vote, but she actually worked for the government in a position that facilitated her obtaining proof of the corruption. Similarly, while the Tim Key protests initially occurred outside of the system, literally outside of City Hall, the Say Something activists, what the coalition is now gathered together under the name of Say Something, the Say Something activists have since been invited into City Hall to voice their concerns, and I know that they hope to bring their concerns and ideas into other Trinidadian city halls and other parts of the government. Today's protesters are also constituents who can help vote politicians in or out. Another difference involves race. The protest against the Contagious Diseases Ordinance, the Kembla Uprising, and the so-called water riots all took place in Port of Spain, which was a majority Afro-Trinidadian space. So it makes sense that the overwhelming majority of the protesters were Afro-Trinidadians. In my research, I'm continuing to look at other uprisings in the South to find out whether or not there was more mixed behavior at the time, and there are reasons why there might not have been, but I'm researching that. So it's another area in which, if you have resources, I would appreciate hearing about them. In the late 21st and in the late 20th and the 21st century, on the other hand, the protesters are significantly more diverse. So Jean Miles, again, is a Trinidadian of Portuguese descent, and the women in the hashtag We Support Thema campaign, as you can see, are of different racial backgrounds. The diversity of the Tim Key protesters is actually the basis for some people's attacks on it. Though the protesters included women and some men who were dark, brown, light, black, Indian, mixed, and white, the group was criticized as not representative of the constituency of Port of Spain because it included too many light, white, educated, and middle-class people. Despite these differences, all of these protests are significant because they brought attention to important issues affecting the public. Not just women, but the public, right? If the earlier protests were fighting for the freedom of bodily integrity, unfettered carnival celebration, and access to water, then the latter protests were fighting for freedom from corruption and, guess what? The freedom to do what we want with our bodies and freedom to celebrate carnival. These protests are also all significant because women and poor people normally expected to keep quiet and stay within the space of the private home, took over the street, public areas. And the only other major time that the populace takes over the streets in Trinidad is Carnival. So what does it mean to argue that all of the protests that I've described from the 19th to the 20th to the 21st centuries are part of a Jamette tradition? To me, a Jamette tradition includes both protest and performance. It is at least somewhat conscious of itself and its implications, by which I mean that if you're doing it accidentally, you might be doing something important, but that's a different kind of valence and tone to it. A Jamette tradition is something within the Jamette tradition is politically engaged. It calls attention to the body and often exhibits control of one's bodies, especially transgressive bodies. Lastly, the Jamette tradition involves pleasure, either actual pleasure in the performance or an insistence on women's right to their own pleasure. Of course, these individual aspects of the Jamette tradition are often intertwined. So, for instance, political engagement has been connected to consciousness of the implications of one's performance, and one might take pleasure in calling attention to one's body, even in a political context. So all of the protests that I've described fit all 5 of these criteria, and this is why I posit them as a tradition, that the later women are kind of ideological descendants of the 19th century women. This is not only because all of these protests involve Trinidadian women. This is kind of a long quote, but the child was the recipient of excessive punishment at home and the victim of an educational system where physical punishment was standard fare. His education and violence was reinforced by constant exposure to the violent treatment of women, both at home and in the community, where he witnessed the male exercising an almost undisputed right to the body of woman. It was taken for granted that males had the right to use violence to punish real or imagined transgressions of their domestic those who were under them, that's what it means, just domestic rules, or to revenge real or imagined slights to their ego. Does this have some resonance? This is actually describing the 19th century. It's not describing today, right? So the full quote, I've put in blue the items that I kind of removed, right? But without those small pieces, it continues to resonate today. So this is from David Trotman's, Professor David Trotman's excellent book about crime in 19th century Trinidad. And unfortunately, almost 200 years later, this context remains the same. Trinidadian women continue to use their bodies in protest because carnival and social protest are part of the culture, but also because Trinidadian women's bodies continue to be under attack. The Jamette protest performance tradition exists because, quoting Trotman again, there has always been a tradition in this society that denigrates females of non-European descent. May we continue to have brave Trinidadian women willing to voice their opinions and risk arrest as well as verbal and physical attack in order to hold the Trinidadian government accountable for its responsibilities to all of its people. She looked for that. She looked for that new nation, expecting it to be a nation. But its open arms closed to choke, not embrace her. She looked for that. She looked for that acceptance in a place not home. She claimed home in an instrument. She looked for that costume, but not too hard. Those are her people. She said, we look for that. Together, still searching, still holding breath, still hoping for the nation to be a nation. So I'm not going to talk about it because I kind of just saw this, but I'll just end by having this up there. I don't know if people have seen this, not asking for it. It's been bouncing around Facebook. So it's a woman who lives in London of Trinidadian descent who created a video and a series of photographs of women both in carnival costumes and in their kind of workwear, different uniforms and business suits and so on. So I'll leave it there for discussion.